This is Lesson 28.5, Postwar Social Transformations. How did changes in social relations contribute to European stability on both sides of the Iron Curtain? College Board Topic 9.8, 20th Century Feminism. Explain how women's roles and status developed and changed throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The lives of women were defined by family and work responsibilities, economic changes, and feminism. In Western Europe, through the efforts of feminists, and in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union through government policy, women finally gained the vote, greater educational opportunities, and access to professional careers, even while continuing to face social inequalities. New modes of marriage, partnership, motherhood, divorce, and reproduction gave women more options in their personal lives. And then we've got College Board Topic 9.11, Migration and Immigration. Explain the causes and effects of changes to migration within and immigration to Europe throughout the period following World War II to the present. Increased immigration into Europe altered Europe's religious makeup, causing debate and conflict over the role of religion in social and political life. Because of the economic growth of the 1950s and 1960s, migrant workers from Southern Europe, Asia, and Africa immigrated to Western and Central Europe. However, after the economic turndown of the 1970s, these workers and their families often became targets of anti-immigrant agitation and extreme nationalist political parties. This particular lesson is about post-war social trends. I'm more of a fan of specifics. I like names and dates and places and events and evidence and examples. But this study of the trends of the late 20th century might be a good review of some of the things that we've been studying all along. Places, Western Europe and the East Bloc, and even the United States. And the time frame is about 1947 to about the 1970s. Introduction. What changed in Western society? How and why did class structure change? The middle class, the working class. What were the new patterns of migration? Why did people move? Where did they move from? Where did they move to? What were the cultural consequences? What about the role of women? Why did so many women enter the workforce? What challenges did women face as they entered it? And then there's the emerging youth culture. What was the economic impact of this youth culture? What was the social impact? And then you had changing class structures. What did we have going on in Western Europe? Let's recall Lesson 28.2. What did we see in the post-war European Renaissance and recovery? We saw rapid economic growth, growth in prosperity, growth in mass consumption, and advanced welfare programs. What were the results of all of these things? The first result we have to look at is changing class structures. Traditional class barriers started to dissolve, and when that happens, class distinctions become less clear. The middle class saw or suffered changes. How did we describe the leaders of the middle class back in January when we were studying Chapter 20? We said they were self-employed, they were entrepreneurs, they were property owners, not typically land though. They often inherited their wealth. They practiced a liberal profession, doctor, lawyer, had strong family ties. What economic changes challenged the dominance of this type of middle-class person? You had rapid industrial and technological expansion that created business consolidation. In other words, companies became fewer and bigger. Corporations and government agencies both became larger. Smaller, family-owned businesses found it hard to compete with the economies of scale of these larger businesses. Many business owners lost control of their businesses. These new corporations had a huge need for managers and technical experts. Former property owners sold out and became employees of larger corporations. What does the new middle class look like after 1945? The middle class becomes much, much bigger. It also becomes blurrier and harder to define. Now, the white-collar worker becomes the new leader of the middle class. And what about in the communist East Bloc? Keep in mind that at the center of communism is the elimination of class altogether. When every single person is of the same class, the concept of class itself will no longer exist. How are they going about doing this over in the East Bloc? They're doing it with the nationalization of industry, the taking of private property for public use, giving job opportunities to workers, and equalizing wage structures. What did East and West have in common? Both sides have a new model for the middle class. They're managers, they're civil servants, and they're experts in many different fields. They're salaried and well paid. They're highly trained. And there are lots of engineers and accountants. They're pragmatic and practical, and they're concerned with solutions to real problems. They're concerned with operational efficiency. As a teacher, that's what I'm concerned with every day. I'm constantly asking myself, how do I streamline and automate this curriculum? How do we get the students to know more and perform at higher levels? How do we measure these things? How do we do all of these things more efficiently? That's what makes me part of the middle class as it began to emerge after World War II. What about that working class that we learned so much about? Remember, they had been farmers living in rural community, and then two revolutions had happened, the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. And the European worker was no longer needed as a rural farmer, but he was needed as an urban industrial worker, and the lines between the working class and the middle class were clear and defined. Now there's a new demographic shift, and it's social equality. Or you could also call it social compression. I made that term up. Feel free to use it in an essay. When you have a rapidly expanding middle class that's absorbing people from both sides of it, that's social compression. When you have a rapidly decreasing middle class that's losing people on both sides of it, you can call that social scattering, social dispersion, or social dissipation, whatever you like. But this happens when the stability of the middle class is under severe economic pressure. So what does this new social equality look like? Industry is becoming more automated. The relative number of industrial workers needed is decreasing, but the need for white-collar workers and service employees is exploding. And this need for more white-collar workers creates a greater emphasis on education and specialized training for everyone. Welfare programs are increasing lower-class living standards, and these welfare programs are largely funded by taxes on the wealthier citizens. The patterns of post-war migration. When you have all these economic and social changes, it's going to change where people live and work. We saw this in the Industrial Revolution, rural to urban. We saw it from the 1850s to the 1930s, where Europeans migrated all over the world, often to these neo-Europes, the United States, Canada, Paraguay, Uruguay, Australia, New Zealand, even southern Siberia, often for economic, political, or even religious reasons. We talked about how all of this economic expansion is creating a social pull toward the middle class while the lower class is shrinking. But that's all relative to a rapidly expanding overall economy. There's still a great need for unskilled industrial workers in the West, and people tend to go where the work is. What were these migration patterns in general? Well, number one, they were still rural to urban, peasants and small farmers moving to the cities. And this was particularly the case in the poorer countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, the East Bloc countries. Sometimes the migration was within these countries, sometimes not. Migration was often across borders. In 1961, the East German government built the Berlin Wall, separating communist East Berlin from democratic West Berlin. You know why? 3.5 million East Germans had simply walked out of East Germany through West Berlin. And the East Germans were determined to stop that hemorrhaging of perfectly good workers. People moved generally south to north from places like Italy, Portugal, Spain, Greece, Turkey, Yugoslavia, Tunisia, and Morocco. Millions of workers came through guest worker programs. In the 1970s, Germany had 2.8 million Gastarbeiter, and France had 2.3 million. These were great economic drivers for these people's home countries because they sent much of their earnings to their families back home. And so this was a significant source of economic growth for the poorer countries. And many of these guest workers came and stayed. You also had post-colonial migration. We just studied how several former imperial countries had experimented with assimilation of their colonies into their governments, the British Commonwealth, the French Union. And because of that, many indigenous people could now claim rights of citizenship in the countries that had colonized their own. It's almost like inverse colonization. Tons of people did exactly that. Britain took in lots of people from India, Pakistan, Caribbean, Africa, Asia. Today, 1 out of every 7 people living in Britain was not born there. France took in lots of people from Algeria, the Ivory Coast, Cameroon, etc. And the Netherlands took in lots of people from Indonesia. What was the impact of these migrations? Well, of course, their labor fueled economic recovery. There was greater ethnic diversity and greater cultural enrichment. Diversity issues. Europeans are not as good as we are at encouraging and expecting immigrants to assimilate into their societies. Many immigrants have trouble leaving their own communities within the new country. Many don't learn the native language. They face housing and employment discrimination, blatant anti-foreign or anti-Muslim rhetoric, and some European politicians make anti-foreign statements in Europe daily that make Trump's rhetoric about Muslims and Mexicans look like nothing. There's a difference between the U.S. identity and the traditional European identity. There was an American play called Finian's Rainbow, and in the play, a character was complaining about an immigrant fella. And he says this line, "My family has had trouble with immigrants ever since we came to this country." In America, we have this sense that we are a nation of immigrants, and that has an impact on how we treat immigrants. Anti-immigrant rhetoric feels inherently hypocritical to us. But your traditional German or English person or French person doesn't have that sensibility because he can say, "My family has always been here. Yours hasn't." New roles for women. So we talked way back in chapter 22 about how middle-class families in particular were having less children. Urban planning and medicine were decreasing the childhood mortality rate drastically. And so women were having fewer and fewer children as the decades progressed from about 1851. So they were finishing up their childbearing years at an earlier age and paying more attention to each child and investing more in each child. There was about a 20-year baby boom right after World War II in Europe. These baby boomers would have a big impact on society. But by the 1960s, birth rates were declining again. Motherhood was becoming less demanding. Less time being a mother means more time to oneself. Women had more time and opportunities to explore new roles. 3 forces were helping women explore these new possibilities. Number 1, there's an economic boom going on in Europe. Companies need more workers. More women are available. Number 2, there's also an economic shift going on in Europe. Male-dominated heavy industries are becoming a less significant sector of the economy. Industries like steel and coal and shipbuilding. The economy is becoming more white-collar and service-oriented. Things like government, education, trade, healthcare. There's a post-war education revolution going on, and women have more access to education. In the East Bloc, similar things were happening. Women were even entering traditionally male-dominated jobs such as medicine and engineering. At one point in the Soviet Union, 75% of the doctors were women. But there were challenges for women also. Number 1, discrimination. Discrimination in pay advancement, occupational discrimination, and part-time versus full-time. There was also a rising divorce rate. Nothing will make you poor like divorce. And if you're a mom and you're taking care of the kids and you can't get as much work as you need and you're not getting the compensation you need, that's a challenge. The third challenge is sexism in the home. There are a lot of men out there with very old-fashioned expectations. In fact, there are a lot of teenage boys out there with old-fashioned expectations. And these guys grow up believing that they have a right to expect the women in their lives to see to the household things, the cooking, the cleaning, the taking care of kids. And the fact that the women out there are working as hard as the men are doesn't seem to impact their views as much or as quickly as you would think. So what's the result of all of these challenges to women's new roles? In the 1960s, you're going to see a rise in women's movements for equal rights. Youth culture and the generation gap. Youth culture had a big effect on the economy and the overall society. Why were there so many young people in the 1950s and 60s? And how can we describe youth culture? Well, we can point to things like trendy tastes in fashions, trendy musical tastes, cynical attitudes, and they have money. They have disposable income, and they're willing to part with it. And that brings us to marketing to teenagers. The very word teenager comes from the advertising industry. Marketers and manufacturers became obsessed with appealing to the youth culture. Clothes, magazines, hair products, movies, an entire music industry shift. 45s, LPs. Those are records, by the way. The marketer's constant challenge: appeal to the youth culture, but don't let it look like you're trying to appeal to them. They're already cynical and suspicious. If they think you're trying to relate to them, they'll feel exploited and disrespected. Follow youth culture's rapidly changing tastes so closely that you can get out in front of it and direct it. The university expanded. The baby boomers entered college age. Governments in Europe and the U.S. subsidized college educations, and this trend lasted until the 1970s. Then the baby boomers started aging past college age. Universities were not ready for these demographic changes of the baby boomers. They became overcrowded, and they were teaching the established curriculum that the students' parents had learned in the previous generation. How might a young person who grew up in the youth culture respond to these factors? Your cynicism might lead you to think you're being exploited by the system, and the university is just part of the establishment. It's just teaching you to be a cog in the wheel of the establishment. Hence, the emergence of youth counterculture, attacking the ideals and the assumptions of their parents, attacking the ideals and the assumptions of society.